Let's start our panel. This is the Early Career Committee panel with the title Earth System Governance Science and Implementation Plans. So on the behalf of the Early Career Committee, I would like to express that it is a pleasure for us to welcome all to this panel, which proposes to present the current science plan and discuss its distinctions from the first plan. Considering the virtual forum theme, our speakers will reflect upon the current plan within the context of how to reimagine the Earth system governance in an area of polycrisis. We will have 6 rounds of questions with around 10 minutes each and 15 minutes to debate with participants. Each round works around 1 question and 2 to 3 speakers for each. So good morning, everybody from Brazil. And now we'll start from to our first question. And we have panelists from all over the world, so we have different time zones here. And again, I thank you all for being here today. Our first round is with Professor Louis Kotze from the Northwest University and Professor Cristina Inui from University of Brasilia and Radboud University, and also co-chair of the ESG Scientific Steering Committee. The question is, what are the main features of the ESG current science plan, which research agenda it proposes, and how does a science plan work to engage and unify a research community? So please, the floor is yours now.
I'd be very happy to go second, so please go ahead first.
Thank you, Louis. This time, sometimes I would pass the word to you, but I will start. So thank you very much, Thais and the Early Career Committee for organizing this panel. I'm very glad to be here. I hope that it has joined many early career researchers. So anyway, I think it will be recorded. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So how does this science plan work to engage and unify a research community? And how does it, in the main features? So what I would like to start with is how it was built, at least in our second science plan, not the first that Michelle was involved. What we wanted to do is something that would look ahead, but at the same time was looking to the whole community, and it engages the community because it was built looking at the different research lenses and that the different groups within the community had. For instance, when we try to join agency in architecture, we're looking a lot to the group of scholars who had more like an international relations, political science background. And when talking about justice and allocation, was also trying to engage more the community that had that lenses of justice and allocation. So the same thing with power and democracy. So I think in a sense to reflect what we were at that moment and looking ahead in terms of the context and like the contextual conditions that changed for looking for the Anthropocene transformations and all that. So I think that's the main features. It's how it engages the community. So, and try to unify in the sense of reflecting what we were at that moment. What else? So far so good. Perhaps I could pass to Louis, and I could remember other things.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Thais, also for organizing this wonderful get-together to talk about the science and implementation plan. I have admittedly not been involved with drafting either the first version or the second version, so I've been more on the sort of external engagement part of it, coming at it as a hopefully engaged member of the ESG network, and also former member of the Scientific Steering Committee. And for me, certainly, it's not worth now wasting time to repeat what is in this plan. I think one can assume that most are familiar with that. But just to reflect on its usefulness, really, is that I think, as Christina has said, in a sense, for me, the science and implementation plan is not something cast in stone. It is an organic living document. It is something that acts for me very usefully as a roadmap to steer my own positionality within the network, but also my own research, my own collaborations, my relationships with other members within our close-knit community. And I think to that end, it very usefully provides us a sort of a common things or themes that concern us all and that binds us, and that sort of commonality that it propagates, I think, is extremely beautiful, and something to build on. It also certainly for me really anchors our research, and just reflecting on the work that Rakim and I've been doing on Earth system law. We, as many others of you certainly, and other members of our community, have really tangibly used the plan in our research, showing how it connects with and how we can think in our case of Earth system law based around the themes and the aspects of the science and implementation plan, which is really useful. And perhaps the last point here, I think it also, and I know that Jonathan and I are also slotted in to say something about this a bit later, is I think it very usefully sketches sort of possible pathways for future research, even though some of the themes are not already explicitly mentioned within the current version of the plan. It does provide us that opportunity to really think where we want to take it, what's possible sort of interesting themes flow from what we are currently doing. So for me, I can almost not envision the existence of this network without this plan.
Thais, if I may, just 2 points that I forgot. When we were designing the plan, we thought also about this idea that when you talk about methods and methodology and also knowledge, we wanted to acknowledge a plural way of seeing knowledge. So we talk about many ways of knowing and also many methods and so we took this more plural epistemological standpoint, so also to encompass other ways of knowing. And I think we'll also, one thing that we wanted to carefully reflect on was on the implementation part. There was the system governance in education and system governance in society. So that's also why there was a part on teaching and education, and also a part on transdisciplinarity and how we would like to build more societal dialogues. So.
Okay, thank you. It was great to hear about this research agenda and how we can engage with it. I think it was very clarifying. And now we'll go to the second round. That is about how does one consider the ESG science plan when developing their own research project. I think it comes now naturally from the first round. And for this question, we will have Professor Carole Ansini from Utrecht University and ESG journal managing editor, and Professor Dhanashree Jayaram from the Manipal Academy of Higher Education and also a member of the ESG Scientific Steering Committee. So please, you have the floor now.
I'm happy to start. Thanks, Thais, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here on this panel, and very happy to see many of you again on this occasion. So yes, indeed, I've not been involved in the drafting of the plan, but I am the managing editor of the Earth System Governance Journal, and it's a community-based journal. And of course, we encourage papers, research that is based on the science plan of the Earth System Governance Project. And I would like to emphasize 3 key points related to the plan and how it can be used to develop one's research project. The first aspect that I think is important to mention is diversity. The plan reflects really a variety of empirical trends that are emerging in governance, and it also provides a diverse range of conceptual tools to engage analytically with those trends. And so it speaks to diverse theoretical and methodological approaches. And because of that, it really facilitates engagement and ownership in developing one's research project. And the second point that I'd like to mention, and that directly derives from diversity, the diversity that is within that plan, is I think what is specifically important and exciting about the plan are the analytical opportunities that it provides in developing one's research project. Combination and, I mean, there are many combination and interplay between conceptual lenses, not only between pairs, but also beyond those pairs. And those combinations are specifically important to consider when developing your research project or your article. And I think those combinations will allow you to identify research gaps and also unaddressed research questions. So for instance, justice, I mean, I do research on justice and democracy. So justice is paired with allocation, but in my research, I combine the conceptual lenses of justice and democracy. And for instance, trying to analyze how can we reach transformations that are both democratic and just. I also engage with justice, power, and agency in trying to analyze the role of specific agents in fostering just sustainability transformation. So I think there are really endless combinations that one can develop in a research project. And the last point that has actually been mentioned already by Louis, that I wanted to really emphasize is the fact that it's a living research framework. The more you engage with it and the more you bring your own perspective, the richer and the more representative it gets. So this is why I think early career scholars, especially located in the Global South, need to also critically engage with and challenge the framework by bringing their own perspectives of how they approach the different lenses of the framework. So we need more South-based conceptualizations of power, of democracy, etc., so that I would also encourage early career researchers to consider this aspect when developing a research project. Thanks.
I think I'll go next. Yeah, thanks, Thais, for organizing the session and also inviting me to be part of this. Again, I wasn't part of drafting this science plan, but I'm someone, especially having transformed from an ECR within the ESG community to now. I have used this framework extensively in my own research to understand different dimensions of the research lenses, because like Caroline said, of course, you know, when you read it first and when you reread it again and again, there are a lot of dimensions that you discover each time. And what you critique possibly in the first go is something that may make sense later on, or vice versa as well. So there's, you know, all these iterations that I have gone through in my own research, looking at these research lenses, and particularly with respect to context. And I think this is what I would probably bring in terms of how the contextualization that this research framework or the science plan brings in is something that is very relevant to ESG and the community itself, and without necessarily falling into this trap of, you know, relativity, or, you know, things are different in different places, because that is obviously something that we all think of. But then I think contextualization, looking at the transformations, which particularly in my research, I look at geopolitical transformations and transitions a lot. I look at the role of security institutions in climate change discourses and practices. And this is very fascinating to use these lenses. And one of my articles that was published in the Earth System Governance Journal was exactly using this science plan framework to understand the role of security actors, particularly the military, and how it is understood in different contexts within Earth system governance. So this has helped me sort of evolve as a researcher, and also looking at various ways in which you can engage with a single issue. So it's not necessary that you are always looking at institutions or actors and what their intentions are or how they are hierarchized within a particular policy space, but you can also look at it in terms of democracy and power, which do relate to these architecture and agency. But then, how do you then find a methodology where you can fit these different concerns together? So that really helps you kind of frame questions better and bring a certain methodology that does not try to do everything in one go. That's important as well, especially for researchers, early career researchers. The second part, I think what I would like to highlight is also not necessarily just in terms of research. I think what this science plan does is to kind of also engage with interactions with the society, science policy interface, especially in many contexts. We know that science policy interface or research and policy, they go hand in hand. There's a lot of there may be a lot of convergence and there may be a lot of divergence in how that happens, but yet that these are not different spaces as such. They do have a lot of interactions between them. And I think the science plan again gives us that sort of understanding of how to really translate this research into practice, into where, like maybe as Christina said, in terms of education, maybe about how, yesterday I was in a session of the Asia Pacific working group, and I saw that some of the researchers from the Asia Pacific working group were using the science plan even in capacity building, workshops, and training policymakers, training disaster managers. So then, it's also interesting to see this. The value of the science plan is not just about research, but also translating that into various other spaces as well. So I think that is something that needs to be highlighted in a way to understand how it can have an impact beyond academic sort of value, and also looking at other areas. I think the third point, I just would like to reiterate what Christina, Louis, and others mentioned, like about diversity and pluralism. And I think that is something that the science plan particularly tries to emphasize through understand. Even when you say transformations, transformations can be good or bad depending on where you are, who you are. So that is very important in terms of understanding the diverse ways in which people experience so-called transformations or transitions, even if we associate certain values with these transformations. So the values may be different, the material context may be different. So in that sense, it's also something that especially in research and also in capacity building, or other ways in which you engage with this science plan itself, that diversity is something, or pluralism is something that is inherent, or if not intrinsic, it's something that is endogenous to the entire process itself. It's not something that needs to be imposed from the outside. And I feel that is again something that is driven home by the science plan, which has given many researchers like me also to explore different ways of knowing, like Christina said, knowing the world, or just looking at knowledge itself from different perspectives. So that's it from me. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, Professor Sunny.
Yes, let me use also the opportunity to, since Dhanasri mentioned the impact and the use of the plan beyond research. In teaching also, we see that this plan is extremely valuable. And as I see Rak Kim in the audience, I would like to use this opportunity to mention that Rak has developed an entire course around the science plan, and that it's increasingly successful. and it's delivered both at Utrecht University with students, but also it's open to the entire ESG community, joining online from Global North and Global South institutions. So indeed, the plan is extremely important for research project development, but also beyond research in teaching and in societal collaborations.
Thank you. So we will go to the third round, for which we'll have Professor Michel Betzel from the University of Copenhagen and Professor Fari Borzelli from London University, and also a member of the ESG Scientific Steering Committee. So in your opinion, what are the main lessons the ESG community has gathered from the first ESG science plan to the current one?
So I'm going to go first as the sole link to the first science plan. So that we're all sort of positioning ourselves. I was involved in writing the first science and implementation plan. I was not involved in writing the second plan. At the time that the second plan was being written, I was actually leading a harvesting process where we were sort of looking at trying to find out what research had accumulated out of the first science plan. So I think that does give me a little bit of a perspective to say sort of what did we learn, what lessons did we learn, whether those actually were used in writing the second plan. I will let others talk about that. But, I think one of the things that people keep emphasizing, to me, the really sort of unique value of this community is how diverse it is and how it has engaged so many different people from different disciplines and geographic areas and methodologies, and working sort of from the local to the global scale. And I think that's one of the strengths of the network, but it also creates all kinds of challenges. And so I think that what the science implementation plan has done is providing a very useful sort of just boundary object, a language, a set of concepts and tools that we can use. So the first science plan was very simple, fondly or not so fondly often referred to as the 5 A's. So some of it you can see remaining in the current science plan. There was agency, architecture, adaptiveness, access and allocation, and accountability. And those were, what quickly became apparent is that those weren't set in stone concepts that everyone was required to engage in explicitly, but they were in fact quite open boxes where people could sort of interpret what those meant, and people could hopefully identify themselves. So, for example, when we were doing the harvest of the agency under the theme of agency track, it was very rare that someone said, I am doing research on agency and Earth system governance. They were often using lots of different terms: authority, non-state actors, participation, for example. But everybody sort of saw themselves in that basket. And so I think that's what's the real value of the science plan, is that it gives some grounding that allows this diverse community to come together. If I'm looking from the first science plan to the second, I would say some of the things that I observe, and I don't know if these are lessons or not, but the second iteration of the science plan is certainly much broader in terms of the themes that are covered, in terms of the I think the disciplines, the perspectives that are covered. So I think it's done a great job of opening up for more areas of research. So for people who didn't see themselves in the first science plan, I think there for sure is more opportunity. Also the complexities. I think one of the challenges of the first science plan is people often wanted to sort of find themselves in one or the other box, but they would often be addressing, for example, agency and architecture simultaneously. And so I think the second plan more embraces those complexities and interactions and provides greater space with it. And I think what the second science plan also does is really emphasize this idea of flexibility. And so I really like the parts in the science plan where it sort of says, how could you take one of the research lenses, one of the contextual factors, and sort of ask questions that bring those together in unique ways. So again, I see it as sort of a sandbox, a play area that hopefully a lot of people can can come and join. I'll let Fari go from here.
All right. Well, thanks very much for having me. Also on this, nice to see all the colleagues in this round. Hopefully next time in person again. Thanks for kicking this off, Michelle. As expected, difficult to add stuff because you basically nailed it with this, particularly with this aspect of flexibility. What I would maybe add related to that is a growing lesson of inclusiveness, meaning that if we look at the process, where I've also been more a critical bystander, but I think a critical distance can help looking at things, as you said. So looking at it, I found the process much more complex, but also much more inclusive, with core authors, contributing authors, and then basically asking the whole ESG community, at least from the main faculty and so forth, to comment, right, on the writing processes, and also having open discussions at different ESG conferences, presenting the science plan. So all this has been the new one, I should have said, all this has been quite an inclusive journey. And I think it reflects something that happened between the first and the second plan, namely that the ESG community has grown so massively over the years. When things started and around the time that this first plan was written, or the first plan was written, we were basically coming out of what was called the Global Governance Project. It's been Frank's earlier project. It was a network of, depending how you counted, 10 to 50 scholars. And the science plan at the time, sure, it was written to advertise our endeavors, to make the community grow, but also to get a bit of a better pulse of what was going on. So it wasn't necessarily as much a review process, as if I understand it correctly, but rather, gathering major current and future alleys of research and needs of research, right? And what has happened now in this process is, for the second plan, is to do with justice to the community having grown so much. So clearly the need of, partly do a bit of a review of what's going on, framing the community, and by framing it also including it, giving it some ownership and a voice. In that context, I'd like to come back what Caroline mentioned. She mentioned the ESG journal. I think it's one of the major steps towards that inclusiveness. So partly coming maybe out of the science plan or in a parallel process. But as I said, I think also with this inclusiveness and with framing the community, there comes also some sort of bigger visibility. There's a mutual constitution in it. So the science plan in the second version has fulfilled much more that function. I'm much quicker on my other points because Michelle really already mentioned them. I think in terms of empirical allies, things have gotten a lot broader. So the early version, the first version, talked about these 4 A's, architecture, adaptiveness, and so forth. And I would also say it was strongly influenced by institutional research coming out of this IHDP, International Human Dimensions Program tradition, which was the precursor of the Earth System Governance Project, with Orrin Young and other instrumental figures, and also this Global Governance Project I mentioned before. So with a strong focus on international bureaucracies, institutions, fragmentation. Whereas the new plan, yes, as Michelle said, is more flexible and complex. It allows for cross-cutting debates on Anthropocene, on transformation, and it does so also when it comes to theoretical and methodological orientations, I think. So the early version used some of the classical types of institutionalist political theory explanations like power, knowledge, norms, scale, and so forth. The new version also takes into account other debates, maybe not always in headings, but somewhere in the lines, between the lines, on complexity, network theories, post-politics, discourse. There's a section on ontology and epistemology. So I think many people, again, talking about inclusiveness, can now find themselves a bit more in this plan, coming from very different methodological and disciplinary traditions. I've been speaking for a while, but the last point I want to say, without really, expanding it, because we're going to talk about this for sure a bit more, is that this new science plan also more explicitly talks about science policy interactions. So about the opportunities and hurdles of making our voice heard and count as a community. So that's certainly also a development I would like to stress. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll go to the next round, which is about how we can navigate the current science plan to address the ESG in an era of polycrisis. For this question, we'll keep Professor Zelli and welcome Professor Jonathan Pickering from the University of Canberra and co-chair of the ESG Scientific Steering Committee, and also Professor Dineshri Jairam. And for this round, we'll have 15 minutes because it's our forum theme. Please go ahead.
I think one of you should go first, Jonathan or Dineshri. I'll just talk.
Have the other way. Dineshri, would you like to go off? Otherwise, I'm happy to.
No, you go first, Jonathan. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. Sure, can do. All right. Well, thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Thijs, for organising this session and inviting us along. And I have been around in ESG for long enough to have sort of remembered when the first science plan was around, and Canada as an early career researcher myself when I was doing my PhD, and yeah, it was very much a sort of eye-opening moment to encounter ESG research at a really sort of formative stage of my thinking in the PhD. So yes, it was really valuable, and I was involved in the development of the second science, in the science and implementation plan. Not from the very beginning, but I sort of came on board a little way along and worked a bit on some of the aspects relating to sort of democracy, Anthropocene, reflexivity, and so I was going to say just a little bit about how some elements of the science plan could deal with polycrisis. And I know we don't have slides, but if there's an opportunity to just share one thing for a moment, which is the matrix, the ESG matrix, which I think is probably familiar to everyone by now. As I think someone said in the film, you know, once you've seen the matrix, there's no going back. And you could even go as far as saying we're all prisoners of the matrix here in ESG. But I think one of the things that well, other people have mentioned already is that the plan is a flexible one, right? It's not a straitjacket. The matrix is not a sort of prison cell, if you like, but it's a frame that can build on. It's as flexible as well. So I thought maybe I could pick up on how the sort of one of the contextual conditions and one of the research lenses relates to the polycrisis theme. And I guess the polycrisis theme, of course, has been picked up in various other sessions, but I guess think of it in those broad terms of sort of intersecting crises that are sort of causally linked, feed off one another, and so on. So in one sense, we could say that, you know, polycrisis could be seen as a new contextual condition, I suppose. And in some ways, if there's any sort of term that is a contender for a kind of characterization of our age, or you know, polycrisis could be one, Anthropocene could be another one. So there's some similarities there between, you could say, Anthropocene and polycrisis as sort of characterizations of our age. Both of them, of course, very contested. They reveal things, they obscure things as well. But I suppose what I would say there is that there are certain elements, discussions that we've had about the Anthropocene that equip the ESG community to deal well, I think, with dealing with polycrisis, right? I guess one of the big themes of, say, the Anthropocene discussions has been sort of this idea that the instability associated with the Anthropocene requires us to rethink not just how we do environmental governance, but all areas of governance. And I think there's also, I guess, that sort of systems perspective that the ESG community brings. There's certainly evident in the science plan. But it's a kind of systems thinking that is not sort of rigid or deterministic, but flexible enough to, I think, account for the messiness of our social world. And I think that's a really important thing to bring to thinking about polycrisis. The other thing, if we're sort of connecting this with polycrisis, of course, we could apply any of these research lenses to looking at polycrisis. And just very briefly, I wanted to pick up on the sort of the democracy and power lens which is perhaps one of the ones I've worked a bit more in. And I'll stop sharing my screen now. So, all right. So I guess in some ways, we could say that part of the polycrisis is a crisis of democracy, right? Of mistrust in political institutions, polarization, growing authoritarianism, misinformation, disinformation, and so on. But we could also say, well, could we think about democracy as a way through polycrisis as well? And there's a sort of body of work that colleagues in the network have been doing on the potential and limits of democracy to address ecological crises. Carol Ann has worked in this area and mentioned some of her work just earlier too. So this body of work, I think, could be brought in an interesting way in dialogue with other discussions about democracy, the potential of democracy to address other elements of polycrisis, things like inequality, conflict, and so on. There doesn't seem to have been a lot written about this so far, although my colleague at University of Canberra, John Dryzek, and Andre Bechtiger from Stuttgart have written a book on deliberative democracy for diabolical times, and their idea of diabolical times, I think, captures a bit of perhaps what we think of when we think of polycrisis. So, I suppose these various research lenses are kind of two paired concepts, and here we've got democracy and power, and it kind of brings us back to questions of, well, what is the role of power in polycrisis? How do existing power relations give rise to it, fail to prevent it? How could disrupting existing power relations help to address polycrisis? So, could we, if we try and reduce extreme, or if we reduce extreme inequalities of power and wealth, could that not only help to improve the quality of our democracy, reduce the appeal of populism, reduce the influence of money in politics and so on, but could it also reduce the ability of vested interests to counter environmental measures? So yeah, this is really just scratching the surface, I suppose, but I guess it's perhaps gesturing towards that idea of the science plan as something that can be a sort of an idea generator and say point to useful directions for research. So yeah, I think there's a lot of value there. Danashu, would you like to?
Yeah. Okay.
One?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks, Jonathan. So, just to take off from where you left as to how the science plan can be, like, again, an ideational framework or an implementation framework that can be used, if not to resolve, but at least, manage the polycrisis, again, going back to what I had mentioned earlier also in terms of how the science plan serves as an important and interesting tool to use in different contexts for different functions. It's not something that is kind of constrained in that sense. So just looking at, example of, for instance, one of the research lenses is that of anticipation and imagination. And I think especially today with futures thinking and looking at the future and foresight, strategic foresight, and so much is, going on right now. And much of these foresight exercises that some of which I have been part of as well, kind of become very restricted in terms of, what are the different issues that are addressed through them. So of course, they do look at multiple crises, polycrisis, intersecting crisis, systemic crisis, all the different terms that may be used for different varieties of crises that we are facing. But then, again, you see a lack of engagement with issues of democracy, justice, allocation. Of course, diversity seems to be missing in most of the places that I have been part of, where you see a limited number of or limited sort of representation of various voices or recognition of various voices, even if there may be representation in different forms. So I think this is where, especially when we are looking at futuristic thinking as to what needs to be done to policy today and what kind of changes do we need to have, do we need to have in research today? Because that is something like the Earth System Governance Journal is also trying to address, to bring in different voices. We have a special issue that is trying to look at these different voices coming out of the global south, particularly, and also not look at global south as this homogeneous unit, but kind of looking at diverse voices that may be coming out of the global south, looking at this whether it is a political construct or other, whichever way you want to look at. So I think this is an area where there is a lot that the science plan can definitely contribute in terms of how we are looking at, say, equitable futures or just futures. I mean, this is a recent research study that came out of an institution in India, for instance, showed how climate models, for instance, the emission scenarios are not necessarily equitable. It's something that defies the logic of equity in many ways. So how do we address this, particularly through engagement with more and more social scientists who look at issues of justice, democracy, allocation, diversity, which are so important to addressing these gaps, not just in research, but also, implementation, policy implementation, education, and many other areas. So I think this is where the science plan can give us these, all the speakers, everyone, Jonathan, Pari, Michelle, all of them mentioned these different terms that are constantly mentioned within the science plan, like complexity, uncertainty, many things that are directly addressed through these questions of, research lenses itself. So how can we use it to also integrate into various ways of, producing knowledge, of course, again, knowledge that is produced in diverse ways and not just, using a certain methodology or a certain lens, but also, in terms of how that knowledge is used for practical purposes, in terms of looking at the future or also looking at the past, because we also know that there are so many different ways of looking at the past that have an influence on today's policies and therefore what we are expected to do for the future. So I think this is where I feel that there is a lot of prospect for, the science plan to have a lot of value in terms of designing the futures that we desire and looking at the pluralistic and diverse ways of understanding futures and what we want from it. Yeah.
Right, great. Then I will continue. These were great comments, Jonathan, Dhanashree. Thanks very much. I will particularly come back to this, the future we want comment you just made. First of all, I also like to thank Thijs from my side. We've been in touch quite a bit over the last weeks, so sorry that I missed that opportunity before. But coming back to what we're talking about, navigating the science plan. Now, I wrote down a few things that obviously chime and overlap with what has been said, but maybe just stressing them under different labels. So the first one would be the human dimension. You could also call it humanism. It's maybe not so much a navigation, but basically one of the major messages of the science plan that helps you navigate your research, and that is that the polycrisis is ultimately, at least for me, a human crisis or a crisis of human interaction, which means, of course, which does not mean that there's no natural science background here. Of course it is. We're talking about largely, but not only, environmental problems. That's what's uniting us here. But ultimately, when we look at these problems and what we're discussing, we're talking about human behavior. I mentioned some of the scope conditions used already in the old science plan, resurfacing in the new science plan, or being extended in the new science plan, like power, interests, discourses, knowledge norms. All these aspects are not natural science aspects. They're aspects that make us tick as humans. They're addressing or they're explaining or helping us understand our behavior also beyond Earth system governance in political theory. So the problems we're talking about, the polycrisis, they go back to human behavior, they're processed and addressed by human behavior, and they're also assessed by humans like us. So I think this is what the science plan makes very clear, and that is a big navigation tool here. And if you look at the terms they're using, they're again human interaction or human behavior terms like transformation, inequality, Anthropocene, of all of them, right? Diversity. So all of these for me are political questions. Obviously, we're talking about governance, but it's something I like to stress. Maybe it's a no-brainer, but for me, that is also something in the communication with other sciences, with policymakers, a kind of hub that you can always go back to or refer back to, this kind of human dimension. Second, well, that has been said quite extensively. So again, my own labeling, complexity and boundaries. I think that the science plan helps greatly to help understand the polycrisis in its different dimensions, how they are intertwined. Not going to go into some details of what has been said again, but maybe one or two thoughts here is that the complexity of these crises in its own right has implications. It does something to the human behavior I just mentioned. Complexity does something to our chances to be effective with Earth system governance, to be legitimate, to make sure that certain voices are heard or not heard. I mean, the more complex things get, the more hidden people can be, or the more maybe opportunities for others come up to navigate, to use that term again, that complexity. So when we talk about complexity, and in connection with governance, we always talk about the issues we have with agency or power. So how much agency do we have in a complex world? And that is truly a navigating question. And I think the science plan can help put out little markers for us to understand that difficulty and the new opportunities of agency, but also some doors that are closing due to complexity. If that has been a bit generic and hard to understand, I'd like to reframe it a bit. If you like, by framing complexity, what the science plan also does is it tries to draw certain boundaries, which is very, very difficult because some would argue Earth system governance is just about anything, right? But I would doubt that. I would say that when we deal with environmental governance, we are, of course, related to the big question, what are our societies? Because we're talking about system governance, we're talking about the environment. That's a French term that actually means around our societies. But that also throws us back to understanding where are certain boundaries of our communities and our societies, and where's the boundaries of our research and so forth. And while we need the flexibility that Michelle mentioned, and we all probably would draw these boundaries differently, the science plan can help us find some of these markers, things that are of importance for us, for example, questions of the Anthropocene, of inequality, and then deciding how we want to frame our research, how we want to reduce complexity in order to shed light on other aspects of it, because that's the best we can do. We can never research the whole thing. And then Dhanashri said something about the world we want, so the normativity and urgency. I think what I like very much in the science plan, that it's stressing that when we're dealing with ecological questions, environmental questions in connection with governance, we are dealing with a particular quality of governance that maybe in this kind of combination we do not find to that extent in other policy fields. So I just throw a few labels at you, not labels, I keep saying labels, but a few aspects of you that make Earth system governance that for me are very important and that I do not find to the same extent, or at least in the same mix for other policy questions. Long-term planning, going beyond species, going beyond the current generations, new types of justice. Just think about loss and damage, for example, or the whole framings we have with Schlossberg and others on what climate or environmental justice is today. And of course, also irreversibility. We're dealing with a disaster in the making. Climate change, biodiversity loss, they're all here. It's not about avoiding them, we're in the midst of them. So while we do not have to be normative as researchers, we have the right to be merely analytical, there is a kind of normative and very specific undertone to being a researcher of Earth system governance. And the science plan helps us to grasp that and to navigate that a little bit better.
Thank you. This was a great round and a lot to think about. And inspired by that, we'll go to the fifth round with the question, what are the main shortcomings of the current science plan? Because we kind of started to address some of them with these intriguing questions and that you presented regarding especially diversity and some of the limitations of some concepts. So for this fifth round, we'll have Professor Jonathan Pickering and Professor Louis Coetzee again for the following 10 minutes.
Great, thanks very much, Thijs. And yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a little bit like, when your kids ask, well, who's your favorite kid, or I'd say, well, you're both perfect, and and of course both science were great in their own ways, so, but having the benefit of hindsight, of course, and the years that have intervened. There might be things that we might think about a little differently. And so I was just going to make one sort of point about substance, maybe a sort of thematic area that perhaps has become a little bit more prominent in the years since the science plan was developed. And then another point about process. So I suppose, like any of these sort of long-term research plans, the science and implementation plan is a sort of creature of its time. Various elements went into it, but we can think perhaps about a certain residual optimism that continued on from the sort of launch of the Paris Agreement, the SDGs in 2015. But by the time the plan was being formulated, you had sort of the election of Trump, Brexit, growing geopolitical tensions, and so on. So there were always already certain things brewing. But I guess perhaps what I would say was that the science plan didn't anticipate the sort of more conflictual state that the world might shift into in this decade. And I guess I sort of think of that in three different ways. One is the sort of armed conflict aspect. Think of wars in Ukraine and Gaza and so on. And it's not that system governance scholars haven't been dealing with armed conflict, for a long time. Dinashi and others have been working on this area for quite some time. But I suppose the plan maybe did not have a really strong focus on, say, the impacts of war on environmental governance and so on. But I suppose on sort of two other elements of conflict, we could say, well, related to these wars, we now live in a more conflictual global order where, let's say, sort of tensions between Russia and the West have dramatically scaled up, tensions between China, West, and are high. Just to mention some, and those sort of tensions are in turn affecting prospects for global environmental cooperation. The third element of sort of conflict was about the degree of social conflict that we see around environmental issues specifically, but also around political issues more broadly. And there were certainly elements in the plan that acknowledge that, say, societal transformations can be deeply contested. It also refers to things like populism, polarization, climate and culture wars, and so on. But perhaps it was just a matter of emphasis, I suppose, that it may not have reflected how deeply some of these conflicts are obstructing progress on environmental governance. And maybe just one related example here. While there's a reference to misinformation in the plan, there's nothing about disinformation and the role that it's playing in environmental governance. There are a couple of other sort of thematic areas, and perhaps one of the more obvious ones in a way in a post-COVID era is that the science and implementation plan doesn't say a lot at all about health. And I think we can thank our colleagues working on planetary health justice, and the ESG network for really raising the profile of health as an area for Earth system governance to deal with. So it's great to see that emerging, and there's some, I think, good work. Maybe it's come out in the ESG journal, sort of connecting planetary health to the various elements of the science and implementation plan too. And thematically, perhaps the only other point was that maybe the science and implementation plan was, it doesn't say a lot about sort of debates about decolonization, theories of decoloniality, theories of coloniality, and so on. And I think that's perhaps when we've seen decolonial critiques of ESG, and I think it's really important for the community to engage with those and have that dialogue. I said I'd mention something briefly about process too, and so I think, and I agree with what others have said, that the process by which the plan was built was great and very inclusive, very energetic, very excellent team, great leadership from the coordinating lead authors, and I think the community did a really good job of building awareness around the plan. So the process point was really more about, well, what happens once the plan is there and how we might review it along the way. So, you know, maybe we could have considered something like a sort of midterm review of the plan. You know, a decade is a long time in governance. And so, you know, maybe let's say some kind of reality check, a sort of little mini companion to the existing plan or something, not rewriting it altogether. I'd be interested in other colleagues' views on whether that would have been a good idea or might still be a good idea. But even if we don't have anything formal, I think discussions like these are a good way of doing that reality check and thinking, well, is the plan fit for purpose? What elements do we need to sort of rethink? Where else do we need to explore? Where are the new directions, the even newer directions for this plan?
Thanks, Jonathan. I could very briefly perhaps just add to that, and I'm conscious of time, is that in terms of thematic areas, I think there might be a useful opportunity to start exploring aspects of artificial intelligence specifically, even if it's even though it might not be explicitly included as a theme. And certainly there are already some of our members who are doing incredible work on this. But certainly more generally to recognize sort of, and I think Jonathan already sort of briefly mentioned this, is to look at the role of technological innovation, but also, and this is some of the work that some of our members are already doing, the dangers of technological innovation, those of us working on solar geoengineering. And I don't want to say too much about that because it speaks for itself. But what I do want to say is something about scholarly activism, what I am increasingly sort of picking up in the network. And I find it extremely positive because I would like to perhaps not think of myself as an activist scholar, but certainly someone who, however you define that, but someone who likes to engage in critical debates, someone who likes to challenge, someone who likes to push the boundaries of thinking, and trying to encourage myself and other people to think outside of the trite confines of our disciplines and the themes that we research. And I think certainly the plan could also consider ways to support those of us who really want to expand our efforts into sort of more scholarly activism work. And again, I simply refer for all practical matters to work that's being done on solar geoengineering, because I do think as scholars, and given the sort of work that we do working within this wonderful community, does give us an opportunity to critically engage with these debates and to also be activists in a certain sense, because without activism, however you would choose to understand that broad term, we are not going to get things changed. And I think it is an opportunity for us to be critical of the status quo, and we should be able to rely also on the science and implementation plan to support these efforts. So there is something to be said about scholarly activism and the extent to which ESG scholars and the broader network engages with that, and how the science implementation plan provides for that. I think it does to a certain extent. Perhaps it could even do more to that end in certain ways, which brings me sort of to my second and final point, and that is perhaps it's also an opportune moment to reflect on what we see as science in the science and implementation plan. And Jonathan briefly referred to this when he mentioned decolonization. decolonial studies. I think perhaps it would be worth our while to also think about opening up to other forms of knowledge, and what we as ESG scholars certainly see as science. Could we open up our understanding of science to indigenous knowledge systems, for example? What do we recognize as science? Do we sort of follow the more trite Western dominant view of what science is and what it should be? Or is it perhaps also the right moment for us, being in the position that we are, to start embracing other forms of knowledge, of knowing and of being, other worldviews that we could use to support the work that we do. And in this respect, of course, we are already doing the sort of the global south elements of our network that are growing increasingly strong, fabulous work that people are doing. Also, many of those present in this current conversation. And I think that's a very good starting point already to do that, but certainly also to urge all members to, when we do research, also to reflect on the possibilities that other forms of knowing and knowledge and science could offer us in taking our work forward, and embracing specifically members of our community who are experts already in this because they are there, but also trying to get other members, potential people involved who are not yet members of our network, and helping us in this journey. So really trying to pry open the epistemic closures that we often struggle to open up and to draw on the rich sources of knowledge that are out there and include it within our work. And I would like to see us starting to have a conversation of how the science and implementation plan very deliberately could help us in this sort of venture. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we are heading to our final round with Professor Cristina Inouye and Professor Michele Betzel. They will help us think about how we can reimagine Earth system governance using the current science plan. So we went through the plan, its characteristics, how to engage with it, what are its shortcomings, how to use it to think about polycrisis. So finally, how can we reimagine Earth system governance using the current science plan? And after, we'll have about 10 minutes to debate. So please, for our participants, you can write comments or questions in the question and answers section here in the Zoom link. And then we'll go to the final round of comments. Thank you. So now you have the floor, Professor Cristina Inouye, Professor Michele Betzel.
I was hoping that Michelle was going to start so she could set. Okay, so thank you very much for the question. And I really like this question about reimagining. And I want to start by some storytelling about the science plan and how, and just to dialogue a little bit with Louis about what the ways of knowing. And on that time, I was very much influenced a lot by the Tao image of yin and yang. And I wanted to find a feature to explain our research framework that would be more like a round, like a mosaic or a mandala, as they say. In Portuguese, it's the same word in English, right? And suddenly we just came with a grid. And I said, oh no, a grid again. I want something more round. And suddenly, but if you pay attention to how the cross-cutting issues and how the question like the grid, it's surrounded by something kind of heart-shaped. So that made me feel more comfortable because we have like a kind of a heart in the grid. And so that brings me to how I would try to reimagine all my research and our scholarly activity, I would like to be able to put more things together that my several beings, like something more like body, mind, heart, spirit together in my scholarly activity. And in that sense, me as a scholar, as someone that also is a body, so like the feminist research, like the embodied kind of research, that would perhaps put us closer to what we want to save, that's something that we call nature, like forests, biodiversity, rivers, water. So that would be more embodied if I would reimagine how we think of Earth as a living being. And in terms of how I would pursue that, I think would go towards what Lu was saying about other ways of knowing, how we not only recognize, but also engage and perhaps invite them and embrace, in a sense that we could perhaps have a community that's more diverse in also that sense. Because we always talk about indigenous knowledge, for instance, but we don't really have an indigenous people that are part of our community. We talk about them, we try to dialogue about, but so far we don't. And for that, we also would have to prepare and find resources and all that. So I think we need concrete ways of navigating that. And the same thing related to the non-human, like how do we really develop ways of dialoguing with the non-human aspects of nature. Like there are some scholars who are working on that, but we are not so far, we have not so far developed anything in that area. Something that I think Michelle can also talk about a lot. I think we have been trying to do that during some of the conferences, but also during these early career events or schools like meditation and mindfulness. We did that in Oaxaca. So I think Oaxaca, as the winter school that we organized, we tried to put things together like research, but also some meditation, we went to walk in the forest, things like that. I think are very important to be more, to embrace more what governance of their system should look like. And well, and in terms of futures and what the future we want, of course, it's their system governance is normative in its conception, I think. And I think we should embrace reimagination as exercise that we do in every conference, every gathering that we have. And yeah, and finally, I think this aspect of activism and how to embrace that and how to embrace more the societal dialogue, because I think we can be activists, but we can also try to learn and to ask policymakers and NGO or people who work in NGOs, activists, what do they need from us? Because sometimes I don't know if I would be able to be fully an activist, but perhaps in this dialogue I could learn more what activists would need from me as a scholar that has been most of my life engaged at universities and in education. And finally, in education, I think we should engage more in how we think of education as for transformation or for positive transformation, not any kind of transformation, then education for people finding jobs and making money. And I just got a pamphlet from, I don't know if you can read, and it says, education should be for transformation, not for profit. So I really like that. So that would be my initial thoughts on reimagining, or not so much reimagining, just things that are there.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. All of those things, but I think going back to the current science and implementation plan, I think that one of my favorite parts of the plan is this sort of combining the themes of anticipation and imagination and the intersection with transformation. I think that, that is an area that just sort of opens up the invitation for us to do exactly that, both to reimagine what we think Earth system governance is as a research community, but also what kind of what we think Earth system governance can or should be in the future. So I think, opening that up, taking that more seriously. And in my teaching, I often engage with use Rebecca Solnit, who talks about, really what we're facing as a crisis of imagination. So how do we unlock imagination? And I think, there are still, as much as we've sort of opened up and become much more plural in the communities that we're engaging, we still could do so much more to be engaging with the arts and humanities, the creative areas, other ways of knowing, thinking about redoing our education. So I think that, echoing a lot of what's already been said. The one other thing I wanted to point out is that, I think it's important to remember that the first science plan was written when we were formally part of the Global Change Research Program. We were under the International Human Dimensions of Global Environmental Change. And there it was sort of mandated that you do these 10-year science and implementation plans. But since then, of course, that sort of has morphed into Future Earth, but we have a much more tenuous connection. We're now sort of our own entity. But I think it still is worth going to Jonathan's point. I think it was around now at year 6 or 7 where we initiated the process of thinking about what comes next. So I think I would challenge, put that on the agenda for maybe the next few conferences for the Scientific Steering Committee to think about how we can do that. But I'm excited to be along for the ride.
Since we don't have any comments or questions so far, and we still have 14 minutes, I would like to open the floor for general comments or reactions from our panelists, and especially ask Professor Caroline Senik, which just talked once, if you want to add further comments about our rounds. And we have 7 people, so we have around 1.5 minutes for everybody. And then I can close the panel for our participants. If you still want to present any comments or questions, please feel free to do it. So, Professor Senit, if you feel comfortable to start this round, and then I'll just you can choose the next person, and then we'll go one by one. Okay?
Yes, thanks, Thais. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said so far. I can just maybe emphasize also as my role as managing editor of the Earth System Governance Journal that, of course, yeah, we're a community-based journal that actually welcomes new research ideas, right? So if you ever have an idea about how to expand the current science plan, the current framework, if you'd like to critically challenge the conceptual framework, the conceptual lenses of the science plan, we do have specific types of articles to do that, that would allow you to do that. So I invite you to check the website of the Earth System Governance Journal, the different article types. We have a type of article that is called perspective, that really welcomes, thought-provoking ideas about, new research agendas. If you'd like to engage with the new emerging trends that you can see empirically, and connected to also the sign plans. Well, this is the space for you to do that. So I can only encourage you to look at our website and explore opportunities to publish with us.
Thank you. So now maybe Professor Pickering.
Sure, thanks, Thais. And perhaps to follow on from the points that Michelle and Caroline made, yes, great idea, Michelle, that we really should be thinking well ahead about the next science plan. And of course, should it be a decade plan next time? Open question, but certainly planning ahead will ensure too that we have that time for an inclusive debate in the community too. And well, connecting that to what Caroline just mentioned too, I think those those discussions through the journal, for example, critiques, insights on the current plan, but also those forward-looking ones, what might a future ESG science plan look like? It's be great to hear your thoughts, and however the process works out too, I think it'll be really important to engage early career researchers too, because this is something for the next generation of ESG research. It's something that should inspire future research. And yeah, we want to make sure that it's something that it's, that speaks to the interests of the early career researchers, a community too. So much work to do, but exciting as well. So.
I'm just gonna follow the list here. So Professor Dineshri Jaram.
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing to add. I agree with all that was said before. Just want to maybe, emphasize what Jonathan mentioned in his, not critique, but like where the science plan can maybe do more. And I think especially with the conflicts and wars and, the whole geopolitical transformation that we are seeing today, there is a lot to take in. So it's not necessarily to look at it in terms of only how it hinders multilateralism or how it hinders cooperation, but also beyond that, what does it mean? So, so it's something that is again becoming a part and parcel of, how we engage with Earth system governance today. So, today we are looking at articles that are coming, research that is coming out on the environmental impacts of the Ukraine war, the environmental impacts of the Gaza crisis. So, a lot is being said about it. So I feel, like disengaging with wars and conflicts and the geopolitical context may be difficult as we move ahead. And, we see more of these ruptures sort of coming up, whether it is the great power rivalry or, again, not assessing it through this value-based kind of analysis, but looking at it more in terms of what this means for Earth system governance and generally, science plan itself. Because if the Chinese and the American scientists are not willing to work with each other, so how is that going to transform the science plan in a big way? Because these are the largest greenhouse gas emitters, and these are they have a lot of stakes in what happens in the upcoming years. So I think this is something that probably needs greater reflection from all of us. It just may be my personal bias because this is what I'm interested in, but really, would like to know more from the other, scholars and the larger ESG community itself. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have one question, and I will read it. And if you want to engage with it in this final remarks, it's from Leslie. I'm in Canada. I am new to the Earth governance community, and I appreciate being able to participate. I appreciate the conversation. I'm curious about how we can engage non-academics along the line of imagining what could be, especially as it relates to stopping the loss of biodiversity, genes, species, and ecosystems. I am curious as to how to create action from your research. Someone wants to engage with this question? Or can we, Professor Zali?
It's a question, it's an answer you might not want or something, because that's a different timeline, but I think maybe it's more relating to what we discussed before. What else would I like to see on the menu is, I mean, I'm talking about teaching or education. I think we can write a lot about that, but obviously also it's not, you know, it's for good reasons, maybe not over-pronounced in the current science plan. I just think whenever these questions come up, how can we make a difference? How can we engage non-scientists? How can we reach out to policymakers? Science policy interface is important, and I'll let somebody else answer that. But my hunch feeling is, without wanting to sound too dramatic, that the best impact and imprint we can make is as teachers. I mean, as researchers, many of you do great stuff. We have our different channels, how we reach out, and much can be said about that, you know, doing workshops, doing information exchanges, having some sort of particular ties to a ministry as a consultant and so forth, to go into conferences. And now I'm actually given that sort of answer. But more important for me is, I think we can make a much bigger impact by educating younger people or even educating teachers that reach people in the formative years. That's a political question too. It's easier said than done. I know it. There's a reason why in many curricula, in many countries, we are not as far as we would like to be. There's also a reason why in countries like Sweden, where I'm sitting, there are good curricula, but it's still not going the longest way or the best way we want to see it. But ultimately, imagine we can bring some sort of awareness shift through teaching in a more systemic effort, with us being one little wheel in the whole machine for the next 10, 20 years, then we start our international discussions at a totally different type of a starting point. We reach a new equilibrium. We would talk about different things in US elections than still talking about climate denial and all these things, right? We see these shifts through other measures. In Germany, for example, the Conservative Party today, they have climate change on their agenda, as something that wasn't really in their minds in the 80s, right? So these shifts can come from other things, from external events, from shocks and so forth. But I think the best shift we can reach is by teaching. So now I gave my little speech, and maybe I abused that question because it wasn't exactly to the point, but it's something I wanted to say.
Thank you, Professor Zelli. Professor Cristina Inoue, for your final remarks.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Leslie. I think so, going in the same direction as Fadi, I think, yeah, teaching is very powerful. And about biodiversity, my advice would be to take students to experience biodiversity, because we can only care sometimes about what we love. And so, for instance, the experience that Michelle and we took the students to the Amazon. I think that was so transformational to students, and the way they experienced the river, the forest, and also the local people. So, so teaching for me is very powerful. I am not a scholar activist in the sense that, and I don't know how to dialogue with policymakers. I get very shy when I'm in this kind of environments. So teaching is my environment, and for me would be that, and really making students experience biodiversity would be perhaps one way of helping to protect it, so people start loving more biodiversity, like species, genes, and ecosystems. That would be my thing. And just one point, that we are all totally sure we are almost in time to start the review or to the new science plan, because if I remember correctly, the whole process about creating the new directions started more or less between 2015 and 2016. So yeah, I think now it's not a really midterm review, it's just starting to put together a new team to think about the new science plan. And I think one of the critiques we received was that we didn't take into consideration too much of geopolitics, Dana. So perhaps one starting point really could be, because we are in such a turmoil in terms of the context conditions that are living now, in war and all that, and perhaps we didn't look so carefully to that, and perhaps that would be one point to be. But I would be careful not being carried out by geopolitics, because if we only look at geopolitics, we lose hope, perhaps. So, yeah, and I think we need also to think that, yeah, as I say, we have to love biodiversity and we need to protect it. And if we love the planet, we will protect it. And I think fostering love is very important as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Christina. Professor Louis Kotze, please.
Thank you, Thijs. I think everything has basically been said. There's not much that I could add. Perhaps just to pick up on an earlier point that Michelle has made, I think it's a very useful point, and she obviously has the experience which she can richly share with everyone at a certain point when we get to it. But it might be worthwhile thinking of engaging again with a harvesting sort of exercise to take stock of the work that the network has been doing, the sort of scientific outputs, the emerging themes, sort of, but also do a sort of a needs assessment and see where people want to go. Also looking ahead, trying to frame future research directions. I think that would very usefully sort of chart the work that we've been doing, but also help us inform the, let's call it a future manifestation of a science and implementation plan that we might be thinking about for the future. That's it. Obviously a massive effort, but we've got a lot of brilliant, wonderful members, and I'm sure many will take an interest in pioneering and supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kotze. Professor Michel Betzel.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know that I have any answers in terms of how to make our research actionable. I think for me, the teaching's important. Relationship, I've moved to a new country 3 years ago, and I arrived and really didn't know anyone in the sort of policy community, and just have taken advantage of opportunities to talk with people. And it's often the sort of informal conversations. People don't necessarily come running to me because I was on our system governance steering committee, but as we begin to have conversations, we see intersections, and yeah, but maybe what I was going to say is I think this opportunity to think ahead and thinking to the future provides lots of opportunities for early career researchers to set the agenda, say, these are the questions that I have, and if we don't have answers, then let's figure out how to get those. The other thing I just want to put a plug for, and this is more just because I've really enjoyed it, is for the mentoring opportunities that the ESG network has for early career researchers. And that's just been a fun opportunity for me to get to know the early career, see what ideas are out there. So take advantage of that.
Thank you. So just to wrap up, I would like again to express my gratitude to our panelists for accepting our invitation and sharing your time with us, and also the SGIPO for helping us out to organize this panel. Thank you all for the participants who stayed till the end with us. And I invite you to get to know our early career resources in our website. We share the link. We have YouTube video series. We have some posts. We also have the mentoring initiative. So please get to know our resources and come share the community with us. And hope you all have a nice day, and also that you can enjoy all the ESG 2024 forum. Thank you, everybody, and hope you have a nice day.
Thank you all.
Thank
Good to
you.
see you.
Bye.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks for coming along. Thanks, Thijs, too, for your great work on the ECR committee too. Thanks.